Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about a very unusual topic, adult migration. To be honest, I've been planning this video for a long time. I tried many times to structure my thoughts and write a script, but I kept starting and then giving up. It's a difficult topic. I was constantly thinking and doubting whether I was crossing a line, whether it might sound like I'm telling people how to live their lives or how they should move to another country. But over time, I've gained a lot of different experience, and I really want to share it with you. Maybe it will be useful for someone. Lately, I've been doing dozens of consultations about Slovenia, and most of them are about adult migration. Very often, these conversations end with me almost talking people out of moving right away. Instead, I try to help them face reality and understand what this step actually involves. In many cases, I suggest postponing the move and preparing better first, because adult migration requires much more planning and emotional resilience than people usually expect. Now, let's talk about how adult migration is different from youth migration. Adult migration is very different from moving abroad at a young age. When people relocate at 18 or shortly after, they usually have more energy, more enthusiasm, and more flexibility when dealing with difficulties. They often also have financial and emotional support from their parents, which helps them feel safer during the first years abroad. In practice, this makes a big difference. We can see that young people who move to countries like Slovenia, Slovakia, Greece, or the Czech Republic succeed in most cases. Around 80% of them manage to adapt and stay. Only about 20 to 25% eventually return home. With adult migration, the situation looks very different. When adults move to Slovenia, around 40%, and sometimes even up to 50%, become disappointed and go back. At some point, many adults have to face reality. Relocation is not just an adventure, but a long and demanding process. This happens even though Slovenia is actually a very comfortable country for relocation, including for adults. There are no serious barriers to moving there, living there, or studying there. On the contrary, Slovenia often offers more opportunities than many other countries. We once did a detailed comparison of 5 countries across about 25 different criteria, and Slovenia turned out to be the most convenient and comfortable option among them. Still, without enough emotional resilience, adult migration can be much harder than people expect. So, let's finally get to the point and talk about how to prepare for relocation and what you should have in place before moving. The first thing I want to mention, and my colleague Andre, who is also my business partner, fully agrees with this, is a very important idea. Internal problems do not disappear after relocation. All the worries, unresolved issues, stress, and even depressive moods usually stay with you. In many cases, people have to face reality. After moving, these problems often become stronger, not weaker. That's why, ideally, you should relocate from a stable and balanced mental state. Before leaving your home country, it's important to sort things out in your life as much as possible, and only then think about moving abroad. If you have health issues, or especially mental health concerns, such as depression or anxiety disorders, it's much better to deal with them in advance. Working with a psychologist, understanding your condition, and stabilizing yourself can significantly increase your chances of successful adaptation. Adult migration requires emotional resilience, and without it, many people quickly feel overwhelmed. It may seem like this topic doesn't concern many people, but in reality, around 30% of people today experience some form of anxiety disorder, and many don't even realize it. Because of that, even a simple check-in with a psychologist before relocation can be a very good idea. It helps you understand yourself better and mentally prepares you for the challenges of moving to another country, especially if you don't yet have a strong backup plan. I also want to talk about the financial side of relocation. In a realistic and well-prepared situation, it's better to have at least 12,000 euros saved. This kind of financial cushion makes relocation much less stressful and gives you more flexibility in the first year. Why this amount? We've done calculations many times for different countries, and the numbers are usually quite similar. For most destinations we work with, the relocation itself costs around 6,000 euros. This amount usually covers different services, sometimes help from consultants, payment for the first year of college or studies, moving expenses, flights, and initial accommodation. When people face reality and calculate everything in advance, they understand that relocation is not just about tickets and rent, but about many small costs that add up quickly. Sometimes the cost of renting turns out to be much higher than people expect. In some cases, you may need to pay up to 4 months of rent at once. Usually, you pay 1 month in advance for the rent itself, plus 1 more month as a fee to the real estate agent. Agents often charge the same amount as 1 month's rent. On top of that, landlords sometimes ask for a 2-month security deposit. Because it's not easy to find housing in some countries, including Slovenia, people often have no real choice but to agree to these conditions. As a result, the total upfront payment can equal 4 months of rent. This is something you really need to calculate in advance and face reality instead of relying on optimistic expectations. At the very least, around 6,000 euros usually goes toward the relocation process itself. But here's an important detail. You need to show these 6,000 euros in order to get your residence permit approved. Then, 1 year later, when you have to renew the same permit, you'll need to show the same amount again. By that time, many people no longer have this money. It has already been spent, and often there is no one to borrow it from, not even for a short time, just to show the balance. And not everyone has this option. That's why, ideally, it's much safer to have around 12,000 euros in total. A strong financial cushion makes the whole process calmer and gives you room to deal with unexpected situations. Yes, people do move with much less money. Even with 5,000 euros, it's possible. But everything becomes much easier and less stressful if you are financially prepared. That's why, when I see someone who has only 6,000 euros and wants to move immediately, barely covering basic costs, I often try to talk them out of it. I usually suggest waiting until the next year, saving more money first, and also starting to learn the language at least a little. According to our statistics, about 25% of people move abroad without knowing the local language at all. In many cases, this becomes a serious source of stress, especially if you are studying at a university or college and at the same time need to live independently and earn money. Without knowing the language, life is honestly very difficult. For example, if you have around 6,000 euros, don't speak the language, and decide to move this year, the situation can become critical very quickly. You arrive in Slovenia. Your savings start decreasing day by day. But you can't work, because without knowledge of the local language, there are basically no part-time job options. At some point, you reach a dead end. Every day the pressure increases, the money keeps running out, there is no job, and no real social life either. You start feeling overwhelmed because nothing seems to move forward. On top of that, even simple everyday tasks become difficult. Things like going to a bank, the post office, or a medical clinic turn into real challenges. Getting medical services, dealing with documents, or handling basic daily issues becomes much harder if you don't speak the local language. Relying on English usually doesn't help much either. Many people are not willing or able to communicate in English. As a result, without proper preparation, this situation can quickly become emotionally exhausting and very hard to manage. In general, the smartest approach is to make a clear relocation plan, either on paper or in your phone, and write down all the expenses you expect to have. You can even send this plan to me or to Andre for a quick review, so we can check if you missed anything. Or you can show it to someone experienced who has already moved to Slovenia or another country. In the same plan, it's very important to include all deadlines, dates, and paperwork you will need. People often forget small details, and later these details turn into serious problems that are hard to sort things out quickly. Before someone makes a final decision to move to Slovenia, we usually have 2 consultations. First, I help with choosing the country and give general recommendations. Then Andre steps in and provides a clear step-by-step plan. In just 1 hour, he can map everything out from start to finish. Every document, every number, every expense. We talk through all the chances, all the details, and all the possible tricky moments. When you see the full picture laid out like this, the whole process starts to make sense. That's why careful planning really matters, and why taking all these factors into account can save you a lot of stress later on. In general, Andre, who is also my colleague, and I have noticed the same pattern when talking to different people. Learning Slovenian can be mentally challenging. The same is true for languages like Czech or Greek. The difficulty is not only about grammar or vocabulary. It's more about motivation. At some point, you start to realize that this language is useful mainly in one country. And if you don't end up moving there, the language may not be very helpful later on. Because of this, it can be hard to stay motivated and not feel overwhelmed during the learning process. That's why it's important to prepare yourself mentally and set realistic goals. Aiming for a basic working level, around A2 to B1, usually makes the most sense. In the case of Slovenian, this level is quite achievable. With focused and intensive study, many people can reach it in about 4 to 6 months. If you have more time, however, it often makes sense to focus more on English. English is useful everywhere, in any country, and in many everyday situations. Ideally, you work on both languages. But if you have to choose, English gives you much more flexibility and helps you figure out many situations more easily in the long run. One of our strongest recommendations is not to move alone, but to relocate together with someone. This could be a friend, a relative, or even a travel companion you find specifically for the move. Sometimes we also help people connect with each other. We usually introduce those who are relocating in the same year. Moving together is simply much easier. It often feels like the stress and difficulties are shared between 2 people, instead of falling entirely on one person. From what we observe, people who move as a pair, for example siblings or close friends, adapt much faster. It's noticeably easier for them to integrate, get used to the new environment, and sort things out on a daily level. Having someone next to you during such a major life change really makes a big difference. I personally lived in Kazakhstan for about 1.5 years. We were opening an office there, and during that time, I clearly experienced what loneliness feels like. This is a very common situation. When you arrive in a new country or a new city and you don't yet have 5 or 6 close contacts, people you can talk to, meet regularly, or do things together with, you may start to feel unwanted, isolated, and alone. Until such connections appear, this feeling can be quite intense. That's why moving together with someone you already know makes a huge difference. When you relocate with another person, many things become easier. You already have at least one close person by your side, someone who shares the stress, difficulties, and challenges of relocation with you. Another very strong recommendation when moving abroad is to prepare a general power of attorney for someone you trust back home, whether in Russia, Kazakhstan, or your home country. The idea is simple. You go to a notary and say, "I'm moving abroad." Then you include as many rights and possible actions as you can in that document. This allows another person to handle most situations on your behalf without your direct involvement. This is extremely important because very often people move abroad and only later realize that they urgently need to obtain a document, sign something, collect papers, or solve a bureaucratic issue back home. And suddenly, they find out that they can't sort things out remotely. In such cases, people either have to arrange a power of attorney from abroad, which is complicated and expensive, or spend a lot of money on flights, document delivery, extra fees, or even travel back just to deal with paperwork. Preparing a general power of attorney in advance can save you a lot of stress, money, and time. It may seem like a small detail, but in reality, it's one of those things that can make relocation much smoother. For an adult, I would strongly recommend having a plan B. Not every relocation turns out to be successful, as we've already discussed. It's important to understand in advance what you will do if things don't work out. You shouldn't burn all bridges behind you. Sometimes a new country simply doesn't suit you from a health perspective. For example, when I lived in Kazakhstan, my body didn't adapt well. I was constantly catching colds, and eventually I became seriously ill with pneumonia. After that, I had to continue my treatment in Russia for a long time, almost 6 months. In other cases, the issue might be the climate, or food, digestion, or your overall physical condition. It's actually very hard to predict how your body will react when you suddenly move to a completely different part of the world. There can also be psychological reasons. You might feel irritated by the language, the local culture, or even by the people around you. At some point, you may feel that you made a wrong decision, even if everything looks fine on paper. And often, this feeling can't be explained logically. From the outside, your life may look stable, but inside, you may clearly feel that the country is simply not right for you. That's why having a plan B is essential. You should understand what you will do if things don't work out. Will you return home? What will you do next? How will you support yourself? You don't need a perfect backup plan, but you should at least have a rough idea. It's important not to completely reject this option in your own mind. You need to know that you have a way back if necessary. Not every decision leads to success. Unsuccessful relocations happen quite often, unfortunately. But if you truly feel inside that you are ready, that this step matters to you, then you shouldn't stop yourself out of fear. Sometimes it's better to try and realize that something doesn't suit you than to never try at all and live with the feeling that you didn't follow what was important to you. Another very important topic I want to talk about is the loss of social status. When young people move abroad, they usually accept almost any job without much stress. For them, this is normal. They are flexible, full of energy, and they don't see it as a serious problem. For adults, however, the situation is very different. In most cases, unless you are a truly unique specialist, it is almost impossible to avoid starting from the bottom. In reality, this often means taking entry-level or part-time jobs, washing dishes, working as a courier, barista, waiter, hotel receptionist, or doing similar work. These jobs are often much lower in social status than what a person had back home, for example in Russia. Emotionally, this can be very difficult to accept. Many people feel something like, I spent my whole life building a career, reaching certain levels, and now I'm starting from zero again. I see this situation in almost every country. I also run a channel focused on English-speaking countries, and I've done many interviews with adult migrants. The emotional pattern is very similar everywhere. You grow, you achieve things, and then it feels like everything is suddenly reset. Finding a well-paid, highly qualified job right away is extremely difficult. Very few people manage to do that. For most adults, the reality is a transition period, usually 2 or 3 years, when they work in different places and often earn very little. These jobs can be physically demanding, emotionally exhausting, or both. Long hours, constant interaction with people, and tiredness take a lot of energy. When people move abroad at the age of 50 or even 60, I always try to be honest with them. Most likely, they will have to work hard and study at the same time. This phase cannot be skipped. It is something you have to go through. Of course, if you have financial savings or a remote job, the situation becomes much easier. But if you don't have that support, you need to be mentally prepared for the fact that you are basically starting life from scratch in a new country. This doesn't mean it's impossible, but it does mean that it will require time, effort, and emotional strength, especially for an adult. Finally, I want to say a few words about moving abroad through education. Relocation through education makes socialization much easier and greatly improves a person's overall situation. If, for example, you move abroad to work at a factory, there is usually very little social life. Often, it's dormitory housing, 12-hour shifts, and almost no real chances to meet new people, build connections, or properly learn the language. In these conditions, integration is very difficult. You mostly work, go back to where you live, and repeat the same routine every day. There is little space for growth or real social interaction. Education works very differently. When you move through education, you study, work part-time, socialize, and learn the language naturally at the same time. You are constantly surrounded by people, systems, and everyday situations that help you adapt. As a result, you don't just receive a diploma, you also get used to living in the country itself, not only working there. With a local degree and real experience of daily life in the country, your chances become much higher. To integrate successfully, to find a stable job, to stay long-term, and eventually, to apply for permanent residence or citizenship. I wish everyone good luck. Feel free to write your questions or share your own thoughts if you have something to add. Let's stay in touch. Bye, everyone.